Good morning and welcome to this financial services webinar entitled When You Want Data You Can Bank On. This morning, my name is Andy Joss. I'll be part of the team hosting you, and we'll be talking about a concept that we started off back in 2019 around this concept of data management culture and why we think it's key to how organizations are going to drive success in the future, particularly around how they manage their data and the data strategy to achieve their business objectives. We're doing this together, Informatica and Agile Solutions, and we're taking you through a series of topics through 2020. This first topic is going to be around financial services. So we're going on an industry flavor around data management culture, really to try and bring home not just the ideas and the concept that we started talking about in 2019, but actually to bring it down more into how organizations will feel and will interact with data management culture in the industries that they work in. Briefly, we'll just quickly introduce who's going to be speaking on the webinar today. So, as I say, my name's Andy Joss. I look after the business value and data governance business for Informatica, covering Europe, Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. And this morning, I'm joined by Mel Parker from Agile. Mel, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Thanks, Andy. Yes, I'm Mel Parker. I'm a principal consultant at Agile, and I head up the data strategy and governance team there.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So I just wanted to start today by just kind of kicking off with a little bit of a financial services background. So for many of you on the call, you're going to know a lot of this already, but actually I think given the timing and what's happened, I think just taking a little bit of a step back and see how some of the activities that have happened really since the beginning of the year have started to shape and influence the thinking of how organizations are going to be reacting going forward, and how key we think data management culture will be and how organizations are going to respond to some of those changes. And the way that we're looking at this is really in two different factors. The first one is what we call environmental challenges. And a lot of that will be to do with obviously the crisis that we're going through. And sometimes it's going to be some really obvious and simple things, like many of the face-to-face channels, whether it be branches or whether it be through third parties or intermediaries. A lot of that's closed right now, and it may be some time before it gets back up and running, and certainly gets back up and running in a sufficient capacity as to where we were back in 2019. But also organizations working where we've got staff working from home, we've got people that are furloughed, but also then thinking about how organizations are responding to this. So corporates, generally speaking, seem to be coping kind of okay and quite well. Many of the smaller media enterprises are struggling. And then you think about how organizations in the financial sector are then responding to this, then very often the contact center, particularly in the early days, it was one of the primary points of contact for many customers, certainly with the closure of things like branches and face-to-face. But there are a lot of the challenges around contact centers really got amplified by the sudden huge demand and huge requirement of time and resource. Allied to that is that many organizations have applications and app technology which actually doesn't enable people to do everything they potentially would want to do in the circumstances that we have now. And of course, these financial pressures that we heard from people working from home, but also being furloughed, and in many cases, unfortunately, losing their jobs, then the pressure it puts on around what organizations do in terms of how they manage their portfolio around financing, loans, mortgages, etc. And of course, the big question we've all got is, when does normality return, and what will that normality look like? So we've got some short-term pressures which I think are going to shape the way organizations respond going through the rest of this year and probably for the next year or two afterwards. And of course, we've got all of the pressures that we had that kind of sit as a backdrop. So we call these kind of the business as usual challenges. And that's the fact that even whilst we have this pandemic underway, there are still lots of activities and still lots of things going on that are driving change in the organizations, whether it be different kinds of technology, whether it be reg tech or insure tech, that it continues to accelerate. We're still seeing that. We're still seeing the concepts and the ideas and the acceptance around open banking, what that means. Compliance hasn't gone away. But we're now seeing organizations considering, well, what do we really want to be in terms of how we're going to respond to the marketplace? We're still seeing lots of movement around the third-party technology and crypto technology, distributed ledgers, and of course, classic things like globalization and the big issues around cyber, and certainly around information security and around how we're thinking about things like insurance as a byproduct of that. So we have all of these challenges, both environmental and industry challenges. And for many organizations in the financial services, actually, if you just think about kind of bringing this down into something easy to manage, it's just thinking about the needs of the customer. Now, we talked a little bit about some of that, but the needs of customers are changing too. And if we think about some of those customer driving shifts as well, then in it's kind of the behaviors of our customers, whatever they happen to be, and I've just picked grandparent, parent, child as an example of that, but the different demands, the different needs and requirements of different groups of customers for the products and services that we have to offer, and how we offer those, whether it be omni-channel or real-time or mobile, and the fact that in many cases we already have routes to market that maybe we aren't using, whether it be messaging technology or whether it be other kinds of third-party technology. And we're still seeing third parties coming into our marketplace because they bring, in many cases, such as the retail industry or the telecommunications industry, they bring huge amounts of customer experience and customer insight capability that's really attractive and mainstream for many of our customers. But one of the things I really wanted to kind of draw your attention to, we're seeing a lot of interest and acceleration, I think, is around AI and machine learning. And that we're starting to see coming through, not just in terms of the customer's needs, but what they're looking for from us and the impact that AI and machine learning will have upon us. So a lot of things that we'll get from AI and machine learning, for example, around automation of capabilities, that's going to enable us through our workforce and our human capital management to be able to do a lot more and provide a lot more capability, either through an app, through a contact center, or eventually back through face-to-face channels. But it's going to change the way organizations think about their structure and how they go to market with their organization and what that organization physically is going to look like. So we're seeing change, some of which is being driven by the environment, some of which has been driven by the industry, and some of which has been driven by the needs of our demands of our customers. So there's an awful lot going on. The way I tend to think about this is actually, as an industry, we're continually changing, and all of these challenges means that we have to. But actually, the challenge that many have is actually that we just can't innovate fast enough. And that might be for lots of different reasons, but actually the markets are forcing us to look at how we do that acceleration and how we innovate quickly and bring those capabilities to the marketplace. And that's about how we stay relevant to our customers, because clearly, as we heard from some of the challenges, there are other people who will go and take our margin and market share if we don't respond to that challenge. But actually, it's not all bad news. So on all of these challenges, if we can think about how we're going to address them, and we see data management culture as being a really key part of how we help address these, and actually the benefits are really quite significant. And right now, many organizations are focused on what they do with cash and about making sure that they're managing their costs. So all of these things will really help improve operational efficiency, which you would expect to lead to cost reduction. But if we get the products, the offerings, and the services right, then this should lead to better revenues, and hopefully we'll get better margins, better profits, and therefore we'll get better market perception. And in terms of what's happening right now, that would put us in a good place for what happens over the next 2 to 5 years. So we see all of these things as terms of, yes, there's change, and yes, it's challenging, but actually the benefits of actually being able to grasp that and hold the opportunity is really quite significant. One thing I would just like to point out, of course, though, is that financial services as an industry as a whole is in the mid of many different global digital transformations. And one thing that we've seen consistently from many of our customers is actually the current climate could actually accelerate a lot of the things that organizations either wanted to do over a longer period, or maybe things that they thought about doing, but now realize you really do need to do them because the market shifts that we talked about have really accelerated the need to do some of these things. So there's a huge amount of going on, and we've always known that, but actually I think now is a great time to look at how data management culture is really going to play a role in how we address this, given the timing and the situation that we've got right now. So if we think about the role of data management culture, and I'm not going to go back over the details of that because we covered that in the webinars back in 2019, but just thinking about, well, how are we going to take advantage of the opportunities that we've got and the timing that we have right now? And I think it's about finding the right tactical and strategic balance. If we think about the different requirements that organizations have and the different things that they're trying to do. So on the right-hand side, for example, it may well be, we have requirements around operational efficiency or the introduction of new technology such as AI and automation. It might be around doing digital transformation, but really doing it at a scale level, really transforming the way the organization works, all the way through to managing mergers and acquisitions and thinking about customer wallet share. Finding the right balance in terms of the needs of the business, the objectives of the business, and how data and the data management culture comes to that, I think is a really important topic right now. And it's about thinking about the complexity of this, but also thinking about how we potentially have competing priorities in terms of what we need to do now in short, medium, and long term, but also thinking about the skills and the resource constraints. So coming back to automation and AI, for example, how is that going to change the skill set and the training and the enablement that we need to have in our sales force, but also the budgetary challenges, because many organizations are clearly very keen to understand and control what happens with their expenditure. And then the structure of the organization, as in, do we have the right structure? Do we need the right structure? And what's that going to look like in 2 to 5 years' time? And of course, the very obvious things of what understanding what we need to run the business, as opposed to what we need to do to change the business. So actually right now we see that finding that right tactical strategic balance is really important. It's about really good understanding of not just the strategy of the business, but how the data strategy and the implementation of that aligns to it. This is a high level view of how we saw data management culture fitting together. And we went through this in detail last year. So again, I'm not going to go through this in a huge amount of detail now, but thinking about all the different capabilities and requirements that we need to have as organizations to help manage these challenges. But if I start to put that into a little bit of context, and if I'm thinking about the world of financial services, then actually what we're going to be seeing is actually we still have requirements around regulation and compliance. We still need to think about how we're going to manage our costs and about how we improve operational efficiency. We're going to have to think about how we service our customers and what that means in terms of things like wallet share. Mergers and acquisitions is still a valid form of change, and it may also be divestiture, of course. We also need to think about the introduction of new technology, because that does play a really important role in the livelihoods of not just what we do, but also in terms of our customers. And also thinking about gloss privacy and security, because there's been a huge amount that's been talked about that in the last 3 or 4 months, particularly the particular situation. So from a financial services viewpoint, if we think about all those requirements, actually many organizations, they're trying to deliver against all of these requirements at the same time. So we have all these challenges going on, and we have all these needs and requirements happening at the same time. So this is where we see, data management culture being a really important part of how organizations are going to make the transition from where they are to where they need to be with whatever the normal environment looks like for them in the future. Today, what we want to do is we want to share some financial services examples of how we're seeing organizations who are making this real. They're on this journey, a little bit of what that journey looks like and where they're going. We're going to focus in 2 areas today. I think it's just purely from a timing viewpoint, but we're going to focus on one example is around regulation and compliance, and the other is around privacy and security. So at this point, I'm going to ask Mel to pick up the story and take you through some of these examples and give you some more detail about organizations who are actually already on this journey. Mel, over to you.
Thanks, Andy. Hi, everyone. So a couple of the client examples that we want to talk about today are predominantly within the banking sector. So for both of these, they're very much related, but from 2 very different viewpoints. So the first case study is around a traditional retail and investment bank. This bank was focused on improving some of their enterprise analytics as a result of the banking reform from the 2008 global recession that we all saw. The second case study that I'd like to take you through is a fairly new market entrant. This is a commercial bank which has had a focus on very niche and innovative products. And again, these people were focused on growing their business more away from the commercial side of things, more into consumer growth. So this was more around how do they take it from that niche bank into a replicable player in the retail space. So if I pop back to the first example, clearly it's a huge bank in the EU with more than 20 million customers worldwide. Some of their business challenges around their data management space was born from the reality that decision making was very difficult to do. So as part of the risk and data aggregation reports that came out as a result of the 2008 crash, their focus was in improving that reporting analytics space. So how did they make better use of the data to improve their decision making, especially across that single view of customer? Clearly, the increased regulation didn't go away, as Andy alluded to. We weren't just faced with the increasing regulation from the financial crash under BSB 239, etc. But then we had the advent of GDPR in 2018. So this compounded the fact that data requirements were only going to increase. So some of the data issues that they found, they had obviously tactical in-house programs for reducing the risk to the bank, but this was really focused on making sure that the teams and the armies of people that they had to do root cause and remediation processes were actually able to become more real-time for the use of the data across the whole estate. So what sorts of data management capabilities were they looking at the time? Well, clearly data quality management and data profiling. They needed to understand what data issues were they facing in the first place. They had to then think about that sort of single customer view, so master data management and reference data management. What data were they replicating and duplicating across the enterprise? But I think the focus for this particular case study was on metadata management. And for this is clearly really important to understand that audit trail of how was that data being used, how was it being curated, how is it being disseminated across those multiple departments that needed to come up with the same answer when it came to data analytics and decision making. So really the business outcomes were twofold. One was clearly the efficiency savings, the operational gains that we got from that. But from a cultural perspective and from a people perspective, this was more around a proactive view versus reactive data management. So calculation on those decisions, the measurement and the reporting internally to the business was done in a very ad hoc manner. So now we were able to really understand, right, okay, we understand that data landscape. How do the decision makers and the executives really bring in what the new analytics were telling them, as well as, with that business mind, so that they weren't no longer going with their gut feel. So it's making data governance, data management, and this whole new capability and new mindset relevant for people who would be essentially the money managers of the business. So in terms of the governance side of things, the metadata model that we started to granular map across the estate, well, this allowed the managers to then really understand how we were able to address those data regulation requirements. So as part of GDPR and BSB 239, the reality of being able to audit your data tracks from any point of that decision making were now much easier to provide. It was visible through the use of those tool sets and affected what was a wider data governance program. But obviously this was at a point in time, this case study, so the reality being is the more outcomes is it's providing the foundations for wider digital and data transformation within that bank.
Mel, just before you go on,
yeah.
a really interesting point that you raised there is this idea of, from an outcome viewpoint, about being proactive and being reactive. I guess for me, that's key to a lot of what I think we're going to need to do to address some of the challenges we talked about earlier. Do you have any examples that maybe you could share around that, what they're doing that now is proactive, which is really helping, from a culture viewpoint, giving that confidence in the decision making you were talking about?
Sure. So I guess from some of the end user organisation, a lot of them were able to understand if there was data that they wanted to use, could they come and find it from that sort of centralised area without having to then replicate it somewhere else. So it's switching that mindset to say not everything has to happen for the first time. We're really proactively reusing data that's already been there and understanding that it does have downstream impacts across the enterprise. And I think clearly that's a cultural step, in the sense that if you have projects and programs that really just need to get things done, but bearing in mind that the output of that would always have some sort of impact, was the reality to go to the data lineage team and understand if that data was already there, and if not, if they introduced some new stuff, what would be the impact? So really just performing that due diligence up front. It doesn't have to be too onerous, but it was at the point where they could understand, can we fast track some of this work?
Okay, great, thank you.
No problem. Okay, so the second example that I'd like to go on to, and if you could move that, yep, thanks, is the commercial bank example. And now this is quite a niche area in the sense of it's a Sharia compliant bank. So customers, if you haven't heard or been familiar with Sharia banking, this is quite a very well, it's a very interesting concept in the sense of we don't deal with profit. It's more to do with how we ethically invest in different products. However, the data management situation is still the same. So for the business challenges for them, talking about from before, was that the company did go through a very fast-paced growth period from 2014 onwards. They had a lot of interest in some of their consumer products that were just bringing to market, as well as some of the banking transactions that they needed to bring together from that acquisition. So the reality is they had to then start to comply with UK FCA rules. And as a result, how was their asset management and financial conduct really in accordance with some of those Sharia principles? So once they were able to get that FCA approval and funding, a lot of it was to do with, okay, they clearly needed to put in the infrastructure and combine with some of the regulations that most mainstream banks would have to do. So as a result of BSB 239, GDPR, etc., they recognised that if they were to start to grow their customer base from something like 70,000 customers up to quite a few fair million over a period of years, they really needed to understand what customer data they had, if they were going to grow, what kind of branches they needed, and what kind of new infrastructure they were going to need there. So I think the focus was on making sure that customer data was safe and being in a position where it could be managed effectively. So therefore, to do that, they have focused on two products, which was Business Glossary and the Enterprise Data Catalogue. So it gave them a much firmer grounding on what was the terminologies that they were using between the banks, how were they able to bring that together, what did these terms mean, what did the new regulations mean, and what kind of concepts in the bank could they share across multiple business areas as they started to grow. With the data catalogue, they were able to then understand what data did they hold, how were they processing it, as you would be familiar with the record of processing from GDPR, and really start to build up a sort of electronic and digital version of that. So what was the business and the cultural outcomes of that? Well, this is a really interesting viewpoint because the enterprise view and the personal data of how it was processed meant that they were able to quickly scale up but still be working towards the objectives of both subject access requests that they already needed to satisfy, but also the wider data requirements from GDPR. The sensitivity of the information on some of the data that they did collect, clearly if they wanted to find out whether you were from a Muslim faith or a non-Muslim faith, they would record that information. So that had to be sensitively handled. So how were they able to do that properly? And now they're new staff. So obviously they had a core banking staff that were there, but they had to bring in new financial services employees to do that. So ultimately they could switch from not doing duplicate or manual processes, sometimes on paper, to a much more wider technical estate and switch on to those financial services processes that they then needed. So some of the key takeaways from both of these examples, I could probably put it into two buckets, if you like. The first one is around those organisational and operational changes and challenges, and the second one is process and architecture. So for the organisational and operational changes, I guess that we really need to consider the organisational design. So going back to Andy's viewpoint earlier around the advance of automation, artificial intelligence, machine learning, we always think that data literacy and education is really at the heart of that. But before you can get to that education space, you need to think, actually, does the target operating model need to change to accommodate some of these things? When we talk about data governance, it has a usual target model of its own right, but actually the needs and the wants of the end users and indeed the customers may change. So we need to accommodate that design as well. How do we link some of those data activities that we need to undertake now versus in the future? How do we actually draw those back into the business strategy objectives and then carve what those milestones should look like? So from an architectural perspective, those data integrity activities, those data lineage activities can go a long way. So if you start off with thinking about how do we map out the estate of what we have versus then what we need in order to transform, or indeed even just satisfy some of the business strategy objectives that we already have, this is where we really need to think about those processes. Is there process automation that we can do? Is there different processes that we can change? So education in that context is more to do with the data literacy of not just having technical teams or IT teams dealing with that sort of stuff, but actually your end user organization, how do they think about data in a way that's not just about data science or data analytics, but more of that end to end. And also giving your employees and third parties that, that you've got to think about how we empower them to embrace these technologies. It is going to be a significant change to automation. I think in terms of the technology landscape in the last 20 to 30 years, change is nothing new, but I do believe that moving forward, the pace of how we can shift things much more quickly will mean that we need to really think about the impact on the business from that kind of standpoint. Andy, do you have any questions on that?
At this stage, no, I don't. Thank you, Mel. That's really useful, and I think it was really great to hear some real life examples of what organisations are doing, kind of what's driving them, but also then what they're thinking about in terms of their capabilities to need, but also then the outcomes, because clearly, ultimately, data management culture is about driving the right kinds of outcomes. So fantastic, that was great, thank you. I'm just conscious of time, so let's just kind of summarise and kind of get to a little bit of Q&A at the end. I think a lot of the things that we talked through this morning around the idea of data management culture and the role that it plays, particularly with the challenges that we talked about earlier, and the fact that many in the financial services industries, they're trying to deliver against all of this and all of the requirements that they have as an organization, the fact that they're trying to do all of that in many cases at the same time. I mean, we've heard some examples of how organizations are maybe prioritizing or tackling some parts of this in different ways. The data management culture certainly has as an influence and a role to play in how organizations can think about how they start to solve these problems. I just also wanted then just to think about this kind of in reverse, which is actually, you think about a lot of these things. We talked earlier about digital transformations, the fact that many are on a global digital transformation journey. Then actually, I think a lot of things that we've seen and heard says to me that there is a need and also an acceptance that digital transformation journey is something that has to happen. It has to happen well, and it has to happen quickly. And coming back to Mel's point earlier, about many of the things that we've talked about, such as automation and AI, these are things that are happening now. These challenges are happening now. So the role that organizations have on that digital transformation journey, we see the data management culture as really supporting organizations on that journey. So it's not just about kind of the individual things that they do and the individual projects they have, but how they're addressing the requirements of the business and also meeting the needs and the challenges of the market, the industry, and the customers. And we see data management culture sitting at the core of all of that. If you want to hear more about data management culture and kind of what it means and some of the concepts and the ideas about it, then Mel and I went through a series of webinars back in 2019 that goes into the topic in a lot more detail than we plan to cover today on these webinars. But today we just wanted to give you a sense and a flavour as to how this is playing out in the financial services industry. We have a little bit of time left, and we've had some questions come in, which is great, so thank you for that. Mel, I've got a couple of questions for you, if we can just start on a little bit of a Q&A.
Sure.
So your commercial bank example is the first question. It seems to need a lot less software capability than the retail example. So first part of the question is, why is that? And the second part of the question, is it a question of approach, so big bang versus start small and scale? Is it to do with the scale of the problems they're facing, or is it something else?
So I think it was a bit of a mixture. So you've got to think about the fact that we're very small to begin with, very niche, more to do with well, exactly that, the commercial market as opposed to the consumer market. So they would have their traditional legacy platforms as much as anyone else
Mm,
to start up with, like the payment processing and transacting and that sort of thing. But actually, the idea of building a sort of single customer view, they didn't really need that at the time because they were dealing with sort of 14 branches as opposed to a global approach. So
mm,
the data wasn't that old to then need to think about all the different routes and things that comes in. However, in a way that solves their problem, because ultimately they understand data governance now from that perspective, and they understand the ethos of why you need to have sort of customer data at the heart of everything they do. So that gives them the advantage now to build out that sort of solution landscape to
mm.
remedy any avenues to try and get them ready for that sort of scale as they continue to grow.
Great, thank you. That's useful. That's good. Second question for you. Actually, on your takeaway slide, you mentioned educate, educate, educate. The
Yep.
question we've got is what sort of education, how much, and who specifically are you thinking about that needs educating?
Yeah. That's funny because I always get these types of questions, especially when we're in during some of our client implementations. And I think it's twofold. A lot of people think about, oh, we've got to be educated on the tools and the technical side. And whereas that's true, but that's more about how you roll out your capabilities. From my perspective, the education starts way before then. It's more
Mm,
around how do you educate people in business? How do you educate people in data? Those data literacy programs should not just be about data science. It should be around, how do you collect data? What do you manipulate it for? What do you need it for? How do you, basically get your house in order when it comes to
mm,
that data management? So the education piece doesn't have to be, a team of 200 locked away in a room for 2 years, but it needs to be small and often, but very much relevant for the kind of initiatives that you're undertaking, whether they be tactical or strategic.
And do you think in terms of let's just pick a retail bank as an example,
Mm.
in terms of the people this applies to, I mean, are we thinking of literally everybody or particular groups that you think need this education?
I think I think it needs to be everyone. However, how
Mm,
you then roll it out would be in your priorities, right? So the groups of people that first up, you may need a set of skill sets to really start your data lineage program, for example, before you then start understanding what you've got and what you want to do with it. So perhaps there is a team of skills and people that you want to educate in data lineage.
mm,
But that doesn't mean that it's all to do with databases and technical
mm,
architecture. It's more to do with, how does data flow throughout the enterprise? So that can come from a very different skill set than you might think. And so therefore, how do you build in data governance nuggets into that so that
mm.
it's more of a journey and a coaching type of mechanism rather than the like a lab session, for example.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's good. That's good. I got another question for you here, which is on your retail and investment bank example. Was there any prioritization on the business challenges and how they got addressed? And also, how do they build the business case for doing all of this? Interesting question.
Yes, and I think for everyone, the journey will be incredibly different. But at the time, clearly the decision making or the inability to do it properly or to get the same answers twice, if you like,
Mm,
was incredibly difficult. So the business challenge was how do they start to invest trust in that data? So to do data quality well, they had to understand, yes, what is the shape of the data that they're using, but also how are they using it, because
mm,
data quality, are you going to run a data quality initiative for 5 years on redundant data? Possibly not. So you've got to prioritize, where is the data going, how is it being disseminated, where is all of this data hanging together across the enterprise, and then prioritizing your data quality initiatives around that. So it's hand in hand of, I think, one challenge led to the other challenge, and the business case started to roll on from that. So until they had enough evidence, if you like, or enough of a case to say, actually, we do need to do this now at an enterprise level as opposed to being project-based.
Okay, yeah, makes good sense. Good sense. Sorry, go on.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say I've got a couple of questions that have come in for
Okay.
you, Andy.
Okay, cool.
Okay. Okay, so I mean, clearly, I've had a couple of banking examples that I've talked about, but clearly financial services is wider than that. But given that banking has seen a lot of focus on regulation and compliance, we've talked a lot about automation, but how do you think it can help convert customer data per se into customer experience?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting question. It's I think right now it's a very relevant and timely question as well. So there's two parts I think to my answer. I think the first part is I think automation in terms of thinking about the key pieces of information, the key insights that we need in terms of the different parts of the organization at the different life cycle. I think really having a good understanding of what data we have, where it is, and how it sits together, and making it available to people in a way that's relevant to them. So, we'll have people, and we were talking about education earlier, people sitting in a retail branch, for example, they have probably quite different requirements from people who are sitting in a data science team, as you were pointing out. So I think automation is about how we enable the relevant information about customers to be made available to the right people in a way that's kind of relevant to them. I think that's kind of the first part. But I think the second part is actually just thinking about kind of where we are right now. So the pressure that's gone on to the contact center, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, but it's still there. But all the challenges of contact centers in terms of with people in there with their skill levels and tenure and everything else, we still have some of those challenges. So therefore, that digital transformation and making this information available and usable by the end consumer themselves in a self-service style, if you want, and actually that to me just says there's a huge opportunity there in terms of taking that automation. So it's not just about the internal use of customer information, it's also about the customer's use of customer information. And if we can start to get the blend on those two right, and by automation, giving us that single view of that information to drive the customer experience in whichever way the customer wants the customer experience, then I think we can start to think then about how we really drive differentiation for what we have to offer, and how we think about how we intelligently use that information in terms of the types of products and services we want to offer to those customers.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Andy. And just another one for you quickly. So we talk about, given that a lot of our clients are handling data strategies at the moment and thinking about where they move to next, but how specifically can the data management culture contribute to new data-driven products?
Oh, very good question. Very good question. So I think that there's a couple of bits to this. I think the first part is, if we think about, we talked about the challenges around innovation earlier. I think there's innovations at different levels and at different scale. And part of, I think, the challenge is that for many organizations, when they want to innovate, whether they want to maybe talk about some of the technologies like AI, machine learning, automation, robotic process automation, a lot of these technologies rely on having good data. And that good data comes from actually having not just the automation of the technology, but also having the culture of the organization, the people in education, to understand what they need to do with that data and when they need to do it. So I think if we can get that data management culture in place, then by definition, we get better data than we've got. We get really good data. And that's when we can think about how we can use it in different ways and at different levels of innovation. Some of it will be small scale, some will be large scale. But we've also got to think about the potential impact of some of that innovation. And a good example, I think, would be, if you think back to the insurance business, when we started to talk about pay-as-you-drive sign insurance with kind of black boxes in cars, then actually there was an infrastructural challenge that came with that. But not only that, the traditional method of thinking about how premium was calculated certainly had to change, because no longer were we doing this on an annual basis. We could be doing it down to daily, hourly, 10-minute, whatever the period of time was. So there's potentially infrastructure, technology, and architecture questions that come with that. And if you think on longer term, just on that same example, then are we moving away from physically putting black boxes in cars to actually surfacing out the connected car data that many manufacturers have how do we surface that out and then use that as a part of the offerings we have, maybe around the rental or the financing of the vehicle, around insurance, or around a wider set of financial products. So I think the concept of data management culture isn't just the culture within our own organization and how it helps provide out that platform of data capabilities that can drive that innovation. I think it's also an ecosystem culture as well. So the more the organizations that start to embed culture and this data management culture into what they do, then I think the opportunities for new data-driven products and services, I think, goes up, because now we have a much better understanding of the data, we have a much better understanding of what it means and how I can use it, and also then the opportunity of ensuring that we keep that quality data with high quality, so that when we offer these services, they continue to be valued services going into the future. So I think it's an ecosystem, I think is the second part of doing data management culture. I'm just conscious, Mel, that we've unfortunately run out of time, so that's the great, and thank you for the questions. So thank you to everybody who sent questions in. I'd just like to say thanks very much for your time today. Hopefully you got a bit of a sense of not just the fact that data management culture we think is here and now and really important, but actually organizations are already on that journey of data management culture, and how they're starting to see outcomes which are driving benefits for the organizations in terms of what this means to them on that particular journey. We're going to be running a number of these webinars across the year. We'll be focusing on different industries. The structure will be similar, but obviously the stories and the topics will be different. But for now, I'd just like to say thank you very much for your time. The materials will be made available to you after the event if those are useful, and also contact details will also be made available if you need to get access to anybody if you want some further information. But for now, from Mel and myself, I'd like to say thank you very much for your time and have a good day.
Thank you.